We talk a lot about the facts of the past, but most people in the Middle Ages lived in a world governed by both religion and magic, as well as simple facts of their lives. My guest today, Tabitha Stanmore, has written a fascinating study of the ways in which people of the Middle Ages would use magic to help them solve their daily problems. Welcome to Future Imperfect. Hello everybody, welcome to another edition of Future Imperfect with me, Jason Kingsley. I have an interesting topic for you right now, folklore and spooky stuff, so it's fairly appropriate for the time of year. We're recording this at Halloween. So Tabitha, would you do us the favour of introducing yourself, please?
Yes, absolutely. I am Tabitha Stanmore and I am a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Exeter, where I specialise in magic and witchcraft in the medieval and early modern periods.
Wonderful. So I am fascinated about this because I think we are going to encounter quite a lot of myths, I would imagine, and I'd like to look into that. Modern myths about the medieval and about what witchcraft is. So would you be interested in starting with what you mean by magic and witchcraft? Is there a definition of it?
Yes, and I think it's good that you've said myth, actually, because I think that there are quite a few expectations when you say something. Well, I mean, I say that I study magic, for example, and people will immediately say, oh, you study witches, which is why my Twitter handle is now Magic Not Witches, because they are quite different, at least in the period that I look at. So let's start with witches. Witchcraft today has many, many different meanings attached to it. It can be somebody who is just a very empowered person, who's very in touch with nature, who tells the future through tarot cards, or summon demons and casts curses and spells and that kind of thing. So it's got a really broad range. In the early modern period, that wasn't the case. It was quite a lot more specific than that. And it was more the using demons to do harm to people that people would think of if you said the word witch.
Right. So it was very much sort of working with the evil powers. That was what defined you as a witch at the time in the minds of people. Exactly.
Yeah. Whereas magic is different. Magic has a lot more applications and actually it embodies a lot of those ideas of what we call a witch today. So what I did my PhD on was the use of service magic, which is kind of practical magic that was used to heal, tell the future, find stolen goods, communicate with fairies, all sorts of other activities, basically, which were much less harmful and were much more sort of embraced by society, but were really, really common, like way more common than witchcraft. Just sort of magic was everywhere in people's lives. So quite different.
Okay, that's interesting. So how would people have described magic users back in the... I mean, I'm particularly interested in the medieval, but also the Renaissance and later. How would somebody have communicated that they were okay with magic but not with witchcraft?
So we can start with the medieval period because the concept of a witch hadn't really developed during the medieval period. So somebody who'd sold their soul to the devil and went off to sabbaths and that kind of thing just wasn't really part of what people would expect from a magic user anyway. That's much more of an early modern concept that kind of comes in during the Renaissance. And so, I suppose people would say, somebody's a sorcerer. They might say that they're a cunning man or a cunning woman, a wise woman. And in fact, the word wizard, I think, comes from a sort of Anglo-Saxon root meaning wise man. So that's probably the words that they would use much more. And they would see those as quite positive people, very powerful people. So you don't want to upset them, but still sort of quite morally neutral or good.
Do you think people believed in these powers, or was it sort of safe to hedge your bets and nobody was quite sure? Is there any evidence that there was a strong belief in it? I mean, it's so hard, isn't it, to overlay one's understanding of the religious and separate it out from modern understanding. But what do you think about the medieval and Renaissance beliefs?
Yeah, I think that people definitely did believe in this. There's enough instances of it for me to literally write a book about it.
Right.
And there are lots and lots of examples of people using magic, practicing it on a day-to-day basis. So they clearly did believe in it. And as you say, I think it's difficult to separate it from religion sometimes because people were intensely religious as well. They very much accepted that God existed and the devil existed. And if God and the devil exists, then you've got to kind of accept that there are supernatural forces in the world. So magic kind of creeps in from that angle where it's basically, magic becomes magic when you start trying to manipulate those supernatural forces and bend them to your will. That doesn't mean that people wouldn't do other things as well. You know, if you're really ill, then you would still try to use herbs that were going to help heal you. You'd still try to adapt your diet to give yourself more energy to be able to fight the sickness. But you might also incorporate some prayers and spells to get better. So it's part of a wider ecosystem of belief and survival than just sort of being off-centre somewhere.
Yeah. So your book is called Cunning Folk, Life in the Era of Practical Magic. Is that out for people to buy if they want to?
It is indeed, yep. It came out in May, so it's been out for a few months now.
Excellent, very exciting. So witches are mentioned in the Bible, or rather, is that a reinterpretation of a word, of an older word? Because it strikes me that it was the King James Bible that mentioned witches. How does that work?
Yes, it's really interesting. I've been thinking a lot about translation recently. And yeah, the word witch doesn't, as far as I know, appear in early versions of the Bible. They are words for magic users. So, for example, a very famous story in the Bible is the kind of the Witch of Endor, who King Saul goes and consults to ask about sort of the outcome of battle. And it's a cautionary tale about how you shouldn't go and consult fortune tellers because they will probably lead to God being upset with you. But that is written, as you say, in the King James Bible as the Witch of Endor, whereas previous translations would say Pythoness or sorceress or enchantress.
Right.
So it's much more about that predictive ability and less about the other things that you would associate with the word witch. She does summon spirits, though. She summons a ghost. So she's playing on the boundaries of what would later be interpreted as demons. But yeah, she's not a witch. At least that's not what she was described as in the original texts.
Yeah, I find this fascinating because I hadn't really thought witches post-date sort of sorcerers or enchantresses or magic users as such. It's really interesting to know that the sort of historical turning point, is it tied in with the change in the attitude towards women and femininity in particular? It seems like there was, whilst women weren't equal with men in the medieval period by any stretch of the imagination, they seemed to perhaps arguably be more equal and less sort of tainted with this later notion of evilness. Is that something you've come across in your studies?
Yes, I think you're right that there was a fair amount more freedom in the medieval period than the early modern period in many ways for women.
Yeah.
Both periods were quite misogynistic in their own ways. The early modern period was, I suppose, a bit more sort of flagrant about it sometimes. The development of the idea of the witch happens at the same time as more misogynistic ideas are coming in. I don't think that they were completely tied together. For example, that sort of adage that witch hunting was women hunting or women hating, that doesn't seem to be true, partly because we do have a lot of male witches that turn up in the early modern period. Nobody ever argued that witches were solely women. That's a misconception. Right. Even Heinrich Kramer, who wrote the Malleus Maleficarum, which is possibly the most misogynistic text of the late medieval, early modern period, still accepted that witches could be male. I think one of the major changes in the sort of liminal space between the medieval and early modern periods was a stronger idea of the devil having more active roles in the world. People in the early modern period were very, very concerned that the devil was actually sort of able to seduce people with his wiles and harm people, cause various different disruptions in people's lives. And I think that is where the idea of the witch comes into its own, because it's somebody who is able to call on this very evil power and do it just because they are spiteful, basically. There's a strong idea that witches are just spiteful people who want to cause harm. And that's where the misogyny comes into this, because there was basically an idea that women were literally the weaker sex. They were less able to be rational, and therefore they were more likely to be controlled by their emotions. And if you're controlled by your emotions, then the devil is more able to sneak in and sort of start corrupting you. So fear of witchcraft, it was definitely female related, but hatred of women wasn't the cause of the witch fears.
So witch is very clearly thought of as both male and female. At what stage does it start to be associated with just women? I mean, literally people today will say, well, witches are women and then warlocks are men with dark powers, which I don't even know the derivation of the word warlock is, whether it's an old word or not. But again, does that come in significantly later in the timeline?
Yeah, I would say so. I think it's more a product of modern gender studies, so from sort of scholarship from the 50s, 60s, 70s, than it is what was happening on the ground in the 16th century, which was when sort of the real height of the witch trials was. There was always, as I say, a strong association between witches and women. But, there were pamphlets being written about male witches and how they did all sorts of horrifying things. And so that stereotype of them being solely female, I think is very much a kind of a modern reinterpretation of history than it is what was actually happening on the ground.
That was interesting. So let's go back a little bit to the church and the church's attitude to magic being used. How did they interpret this? Because obviously the church was very powerful in the medieval period and arguably has been for a lot of Western history. How did they deal with this idea that there was magic from other things? Was it all fully integrated or?
Various different approaches. The church, as you say, was an incredibly powerful institution, but it did also have a lot of people working within it and a quite an unstable structure in a lot of the time. I mean, partly just because of the way that news would travel relatively slowly, new ideas would spread quite slowly. So there were lots of interpretations of how religion should be practiced right all across Christendom. And that meant that there was some confusion about what was magic and what was orthodox religion, and therefore whether people were overstepping the boundary. So especially in the 11th and 12th and even 13th centuries, there was quite a lot of debate about some activities that people were doing and a question of whether that was superstition or whether it was bad magic or whether it was actually totally fine. A lovely example of that is the dog saint, St. Guinevere, who local people in northern France worshipped as a saint that was literally a dog, but he would also protect children. And they would give his shrine offerings, they would take newborns to the shrine to have him protected. And when the local bishop turned up to sort of check how things were going in this area, he basically said that this was clearly magic and it was, borderline heresy. That's not how the local priests saw it. They saw this as an absolutely fine practice and totally orthodox religion. So there was a strong debate about what is acceptable and what's not. And that changes as we go closer to the modern period, with people sort of really straightening out the lines of what counts as good Christianity and not. But even then, there's still a bit of overlap between magic and religion.
Yes, the sort of grassroots seems to be okay with both existing at the same time. And I wonder how the church differentiated between, magic made by God that was legitimate and magic that was sort of other. I suppose if witches were supposed to have the other, the devil was supposed to be the source of their magic. But was that the case? What was the source of the magic for sorcerers? Was that outside the Christian pantheon somehow?
Most of the time it was actually within the Christian pantheon. A lot of cunning folk would argue that they were good people because they were working through God or angels or fairies, which are kind of a strange being that's in between angels and demons. So yeah, they would have seen themselves as actually very good Christians most of the time. The church would sometimes correct them and tell them that that's definitely not
right.
how you should be doing these things. But yeah, I think most people would have seen themselves as working through divine powers, if they thought about it at all, because some people just wouldn't really think about it that closely. It was just, this is a spell, it works, nothing bad seems to come of it, and carry on.
Right, I see what you mean. So I'm wondering whether the sort of philosophy behind it slowly changing towards a more negative perception of the sort of cunning folk was that the church wanted a monopoly on magic, perhaps. That they didn't like there being other supernatural powers that could have an effect on people's lives. They felt that was somehow disempowering them.
Yes, I think to an extent. And you do see local branches of the church, so local priests, almost in competition with cunning folk sometimes, even up into the 17th century, where a potential client of a cunning person will visit the cunning person to ask for a healing spell, for example, and the priest will argue that they should really be going to him instead to get the right prayers. And so there's professional rivalry going on between the church and cunning folk.
Oh, there must have been some really good arguments at a local level of people saying, no, I can do it better. Mm-hmm. I mean, do we have any record of that kind of interaction, of having arguments over a client?
So we do have a couple. Obviously, it's impossible to be a fly on the wall and actually watch this happening, but there's a lovely case, I think it's from the 1610s, where a man is prosecuted by the church. He's sort of investigated by the church courts for using a cunning woman to heal his wife. And he stands up and says in the court, in front of his local priest, yes, I used this cunning woman and I would do so again because she is more effective than Mr. Woods, the local priest, despite him being the minister of God's word. So, yeah, you can imagine how smug this cunning woman must have been hearing this.
Well, that's interesting testimony because that's in a court of law and you're, bound by oath to tell the truth. So he presumably genuinely believed that and was possibly slightly outraged that the church was saying, no, you've got to come to to us, because he's literally saying, well, this woman did it better.
Absolutely. Yeah, and bear in mind that also, individual priests are going to be better or worse at their jobs. So if you think that actually your priest is a bit morally dodgy, doesn't know his scripture very well, but you do know the cunning woman has like a really, really good spell and she's always a really nice person to everybody, well, which one are you going to trust more?
Yeah, so local empowerment. So you mentioned in your book trial by combat and magic. So how does that work? How is magic used in trial by combat?
Okay, so I'm going to say now, I'm pretty sure you're going to know more about trial by combat than I do in general.
I don't know. Let's see. Maybe not.
Well, I mean, obviously I approach it from a magic angle, which is that, as you say, there was a strong tradition of using spells to help one of the combatants gain an edge. So spells, or kind of charms, I suppose, written charms, could be sewn into a combatant's leather armor to help protect them, or to sort of say something like, oh, God, give me the victory, or I am the stronger of these two fighters, or something like that. But there were also rituals that you could perform before the trial happened to help give you an edge as well. So, for example, one thing that the church would say was superstition, I would call magic, other people in the time period would just call common sense, was watching the Eucharist being performed before you went out into battle. Because the idea is that you've witnessed this miracle of God's salvation, and you can carry that with you into battle. And, people thought that they would be protected for an entire day after having seen communion being taken. So if you did that, then the church would kind of see that as cheating.
Right.
Because, you shouldn't be sort of rebalancing the odds like this. But of course, people were going to do it. If they wanted to win this trial and they wanted to show that God was on their side, then of course you're going to try anything to make sure that happens. So yeah, it gets incorporated a lot.
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because the theory of trial by combat is that God will not let a bad person win over a good person. The guilty cannot defeat the innocent because God will protect them. But if you've also got this idea that you could hedge your bets, it's kind of almost saying that God can be influenced by magic, and maybe the baddie can win as a result of charms and spells. I mean, we know that swords often had etchings on them. They even had prayers on them, especially in the Teutonic Order, and the Templars were very kind of aware of this as prayers and purity going into combat. And so I guess you could look at words on weapons as partly charms as well. And people had it on armour. They had Latin inscriptions about protection called pointil work. It's little points that go together to sort of make up the words. And they had that on armour, even up into the 15th century. You see it. Some of it's beautiful. So they obviously felt that it had power there. So why not? Why not hedge your bets in trial by combat?
Absolutely. It's an interesting one, as you say, because it sounds like it should be blasphemy, doesn't it?
Yes.
Forcing God to behave in a certain way, that can't be right. But I mean, one of the most famous cases we have of magic being used in trial by combat, and which I sort of talk about in my book, is a trial by combat between the Bishop and the Earl of Salisbury, and the Bishop of Salisbury's champion is the one who's carrying the magic spells.
Right.
So he clearly didn't see a problem with this. And if anybody should be an authority on what is acceptable religion, you think it would be a bishop. But he didn't see an issue with it.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with you there entirely, but we know about bishops. The bishops ran bawdy shops in Southwark, South London, and, took the rent from them. And Winchester, in particular, the Winchester geese were well known as a saying at the time. And I think it was Bishop Odo was Duke William's brother, and he fought the Battle of Hastings, but he had to have a club because I'm led to believe that he wasn't supposed to draw blood. And I've used a club and it will draw blood very easily, but apparently that's a different way of drawing blood. Smash somebody over the head with a big lump of wood, that's acceptable. But hit them over the head with a sword, you're going to cut them, and that's somehow less acceptable for a bishop. Just the idea of a fighting bishop is quite bizarre by modern terms, but interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. And it shows the kind of moral acrobatics that the church would sometimes do.
Yes.
But as you say, there are ways around it. And even the Winchester geese, I mean, it sounds incredibly hypocritical, and I would agree with you, it is. But the Bishop of Winchester had a theory about why it was actually a good thing to house sex workers and sort of regulate their activities. And that was that it was better to sort of control sin and have it happen in a safe environment than let it sort of spill out everywhere, which, again, I mean, he was clearly making a lot of money out of it, and it's still exploitation. But
I would say it was a thin argument, but nonetheless an argument. Theologically, it's got some value, but it's not particularly persuasive, in my opinion. There's a thing you talk about, the Black Fast as well. Is that something you want to sort of tell us about? I've never heard that term before.
Yeah, it's a really interesting ritual, and it is actually part of Orthodox Christianity again. It just can then be reused for a more practical purpose. So it's basically, originally it was a form of devotion. It's basically where you only eat bread and water, or you only drink water and sort of starve yourself for a day or up to 3 days. And the idea is that you sort of focus more and more on God. It's very, very religious. It was performed originally by the most dedicated people in society. But it does get reused up until the 17th century, even in England and in Catholic areas even later, to harm people. And it's the idea that you're basically using a sympathetic link and also taking the kind of divine righteousness of God to starve somebody else. So if you starve yourself and you kind of focus all of your energy on your own aching belly, but also the person that you want to see suffer, then you can take your own pains and suffering and reflect that out onto the target.
Oh, that's interesting. So you suffer yourself, but then you reflect the suffering onto your target, your victim.
Exactly. Yeah.
Was that just through thought? I mean, I'm trying to work out how the victim would ever know. I mean, I suppose if they felt stomach cramps, they go and eat, don't they? How does that work?
Well, so they wouldn't be forced to starve as well. They would feel the effects of your starvation.
Right.
So they'd end up losing weight even though they were still eating, or they would just become weaker and weaker as you became weaker. So it's kind of a zero-sum game, everybody's suffering really. But you wouldn't necessarily need to know that you were cursed in order for it to work, in theory, because you're basically sapping their strength along with your own through the spell.
Does that tie in with the idea of taking sort of wax offerings to the tomb of, Hereford Cathedral has got one of the Thomases, one of the Holy Thomases, and you can cure limbs and things, and people would buy wax facsimiles of their bad leg and sort of give it to this tomb. And supposedly that would then be reflected. They would get the blessing and they would get a cure. And I was thinking about sort of voodoo dolls and putting pins in an object. And I think they found Roman curses and things put into, holy wells or whatever with, may somebody's hair fall out or something or their feet hurt. It's this idea that you could somehow have another thing associated with a person. You do the magic thing to the object and it transfers to this person. Is that the same kind of sympathetic magic that we're talking about here?
Yeah, I think so. It definitely all links to the same basic idea of creating a link between you and your emotions and your target and the way they're going to end up feeling. And yeah, they're all different methods to basically achieve the same end. And bear in mind that we live, as far as we know, on a kind of linear time. So the curse tablets that were being used in sort of ancient Rome, a lot of that theory that went behind them does inform magic in the later medieval period and in the early modern period as well. It's this idea of forming a bond. So sometimes you do need to have the essence of the person that you want to enchant or bewitch or curse. So that could be that, for example, if you do want to go down the poppet or the curse doll route, then getting hold of somebody's fingernails or some of their hair or something like that, something that you can sort of show that it is, that the representation is that person.
A piece of them, basically.
Yeah, exactly. So that when you inflict harm on their facsimile, it's clearly going to be affecting them as well because, you've got their essence.
Right. I shall have to tidy up my fingernails more carefully. Yeah, I was thinking, I've got horses and I trim horses' hooves, and I was thinking, what if horses' hooves, they're really big. You could do something with them. I'm not sure what you would do with them, but there you go. So was magic restricted socially? We've talked about cunning folk, and there's an implication, in my mind anyway, that it tends to be peasants and the less well-educated or the less wealthy. Is that the case? Is this magic more constrained around ordinary level people, or does it go to the richer, nobility?
No, it's actually everybody.
Okay.
Magic feeds into a very widely held belief system about how the world works. And so, it definitely wasn't something which was restricted to the lowest in society or like the people who were just sort of superstitious and uneducated. The church would definitely use that stereotype to try to stop people from using magic because it's kind of a sort of social shaming thing. Mm-hmm. But that didn't stop the nobility, the aristocracy, and monarchs using magic.
Right, so kings and queens use magic.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's...
you're going to have to tell us about that.
So I think in the period I look at, which is about 1350 to 1650, I think there are about 8 monarchs who lived during that time, and all of them brushed up against magic in some way. Some of them were the targets of magic plots, but others actually did sort of just employ magic themselves, or were thought to employ magic.
Well, how do we know? Because I was thinking, for some reason, John Dee came into my mind with Elizabeth.
Yes.
Now, I'm probably wrong because it's not my period at all, but the idea of having kind of Renaissance era magic practitioners sort of fits in with their clothing for some reason. I don't know why, and goatees and their style and fashion. Is that a thing?
So yes, it's definitely a thing. And actually, I think one of the reasons that you have that association is because what you're thinking of is the big floppy hat of a doctor and the big flappy black robes of a scholar. Because people like John Dee, very, very highly educated. He was a fantastic astronomer. He was a mathematician. He knew many, many languages. In many ways, an incredible guy. But he spent a lot of his time at universities and places of learning across Europe. And universities would often house a lot of magic books.
Oh.
So he studied magic at university as well as everything else that he studied. And he used his knowledge of the way that the stars move, his knowledge of divinity, his knowledge of Greek and Hebrew and Latin to his own ends. And he would literally summon angels. So he's got so many notebooks filled with methods for summoning angels to answer his questions and to help him find gold mines across England. And also to do things like cast horoscopes to tell Queen Elizabeth how long her reign was going to be and how successful it was going to be.
I love this idea of the people of the Renaissance, sort of people having multifaceted, studying astronomy, but also happening to study witchcraft and magic use. And, imagine if universities were like that these days. I did a zoology degree, and if I'd have done zoology and magic, that would be rather cool. I quite like that idea. I think we should reintroduce that. So basically, Hogwarts is not new. This is what people actually did. They studied magic at university.
So yes, they did. It was always more of an extracurricular activity, I should say.
Right.
Because as I say, these university libraries, they did house a lot of books and, you wouldn't be able to sign up for a module on magic.
Right.
But if you did sign up for divinity, for example, then you would learn things like rites of exorcism. You'd understand a lot more of the nature of God. And if you know those things, exorcism rites especially, if you know how to cast a demon out of somebody, then you also know how to control a demon to bring them into a magic circle, for example, and make them do your will.
Of course, that touches on that. And there are exorcists today, aren't there, in the Catholic Church?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And in the Anglican Church as well, apparently. I didn't know this until recently.
Oh, that's really interesting. So you talk about books of magic. Do these books of magic still exist?
They do, yeah. Most of them are in the British Library.
Oh, wow. What are they called? Do they have names? I don't mean John or Fred. I mean, what are their titles?
Well, they're normally called incredibly boring things now, which are their class marks. So they're called like Harley Manuscript 9752 or something. So, if you want to look them up, then just contact somebody at the British Library. They'll be able to point in the right direction. But there were some quite common ones that circulated. So they're normally called grimoires, but specific ones were things like the Picatrix, I think is one of the most famous ones. And this was largely a book of philosophy, but it was a book of philosophy that explained how the universe worked. And again, if you know how the universe worked, and bearing in mind that medieval and early modern understandings of how the universe does like this, like the stars are moved around by spirits or angels.
Right.
So if you know which angels to call on according to what's in the sky at the time, then you can kind of influence what happens on Earth. So they're quite complex magic books.
Okay.
But they do have some very interesting spells in them for everything from creating the illusion of a castle to just sort of appear in a field, all the way to being able to learn Latin quicker because they were written by scholars.
Wow, that's interesting. So magic was used for quite a wide variety of tasks.
Mm-hmm.
Well, look, it's been absolutely lovely chatting. If people want to find out more about Cunning Folk, Life in the Era of Practical Magic, it's available, the book's available. But what about following you on social media or, your work? Is there any way they can find out more about what you do?
Absolutely. So my X handle is @MagicNotWitches and my Instagram handle is Tabitha Stanmore. I'm doing various different book talks up and down the country over the next few months. So if anybody wants to drop in and say hi, just check Twitter. I'm normally on there somewhere.
Oh, that's wonderful. I think it's a subject I need to read up a bit more about because it's almost one of those hidden things about the medieval period that I think I should try and find out more about because it seems like it probably influenced the high and the low in all sorts of different complex ways. That's really interesting. Was there anything else you wanted to say that you feel are listeners should know about the cunning folk?
I think actually what you just said, it is, I think, a really, really important part of our history. And as you say, we normally think of it as something which is sort of done off to the side. It's something that real history doesn't engage with. But I actually think it was such a fundamentally important part of people's belief systems and just the way that they got through the day that it probably deserves more attention than we normally give it. So yeah, any believers out there, you're not alone. There's a long history of it.
Thank you very much for chatting about magic in the medieval and early modern. It's been a delight talking to you.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been great.